Hi, thank you all for joining us. I wanted to make a quick introduction as we get started. We've got a handful of folks still trickling in, and we appreciate you spending this hour with us today. If you have been with us before, you probably know myself and Ken. We do a lot of these webinars together, so we're really excited about this one in particular. My name is Eden Barnhouse. I'm our marketing manager, and I have the great fortune of introducing Ken Jackson today. He is a great resource for you all. He's our Chief Client Officer. If you are not already familiar with who he is or seen any of his webinars or presentations before. So I'll let him do a more formal introduction of himself and his past experiences and how he becomes a resource for you all in this topic of price transparency. So as we get started, first off, a huge thank you to all of you for joining today. We really are looking forward to this subject matter. We're looking forward to this material, and Ken has put together a really great presentation detailing not only what has happened pre-2025, but also talking about a lot of the regulation changes that happened in 2025 and what those are going to look like in 2026 when we're finally going to see what those requirements and those fees of not hitting those requirements look like. So lots going on today. We'll have a really great presentation. But the last piece of housekeeping is we want this to be as specific as possible to you and your team. So we have a Q&A button in the Teams chat, and I will go ahead and post a message in there myself so that you can find it very easily. But we encourage that you and whoever's watching with you or your teams, if you have any questions or specific examples of any issues you all have had that you want to ask Ken while we're here together on the webinar today, we will happily ask those to him. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A towards the end of the hour. But if we are unable to talk through your question while we have time together today, we're unable to get to it, we will happily reach out to you and your team and make sure that you have all the answers you need going into 2026 and you feel ready to hit at least the minimum level of requirement and you feel confident going into the new year. So with all of that, I'm going to take myself off screen. I'll go ahead and post that message in the Q&A, and I happily get to turn things over to Ken. Ken, take it away.
Awesome. Hopefully, microphone's on, camera's on, life is good. All right. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here today to talk to everybody about this. It is a huge undertaking to talk about price transparency. So I'm not going to pretend at the beginning that we're going to hit it all, that we're going to discuss every nuance. But we are going to try to go through and figure out a few things. So before we get started with the agenda, let me just reintroduce myself. I am one of the founders at Sliced, Chief Client Officer here, and you can see a little bit of my background there. Probably the more relevant for what's happening here is having had that experience in the hospital, but now being on this vendor side, knowing what it's like to try to keep up with everything that's going on with price transparency and the different regulations as they come out. It is a daunting task. We've had a little bit of a lull for the past 12 months or so, but I'm pretty sure we're about to see that ramp up over the next couple of years. So excited to talk through this with you guys. Here is the agenda that I'm going to try to follow today. We're going to talk through what is price transparency. We'll go back to the beginning, talk a little bit about it, how we got to where we are today, what's happened in 2025, what's going on for 1/1/26 as far as compliance, specifically on that machine-readable file. We'll talk about the definition of compliance, some of the challenges of compliance, because there are a lot. How to begin preparing for compliance. So, because I don't know everyone on the call today or on the webinar today, I know I've got some clients on the call, and I know I have some that are not. People are at different places of compliance, and you may feel, like you've got it together, and some of you may be questioning and wondering. And so just going to give you some hints on how to prepare and make that whole thing for 1/1/26 a little bit easier. Um, so if my clients on the call feel like I'm giving them work to do, I kind of am. Um, so I apologize for that. And then the future of compliance is really me reading tea leaves with my own vent of what I think we're going to see in the future that we should really be taking a hard look at and thinking about as far as the trend and the direction that this could go. And then hopefully we'll have time to answer some of those questions. So let's start with what price transparency is. I mean, you can see here we kind of have a timeline on here of 2019 to now. And that is because this all started with an executive order from the Trump administration back in 2019. CMS started working on it. And as they described what they were trying to accomplish with price transparency, these were the three things they said this was going to do. It was going to empower patients, give them more control over their medical care and shopping for services. It was going to create more competition, which I think the real intent there was that maybe that would drive prices down. And typically, people think in a capitalist market, right? The more competition, the better the pricing, the better the value. And then the last thing is to try to keep people from being surprised by what they were being charged for the medical services they were getting. We can all argue whether or not this has really helped that process or not. Pieces of it probably has. You'll hear me multiple times probably say that the machine readable file is not a part of helping these processes, but shoppable services maybe. When it was originally designed, right, 2019, the very first implementation, I would say, was 2021. This is when everybody in theory began to be held accountable to this executive order and this regulation. There were two things that we were primarily concerned with. So let me talk about the machine readable file first. And it's interesting if you go back and read all of the information at the time. The machine readable file, as I looked at the way this thing was rolled out, was never designed, and I think we can all agree, was never designed for a consumer to look at. I've always said, God help the patient that gets hold of a machine readable file and then tries to figure out what's in there. They actually kind of clearly said, this machine readable file is about research. This machine readable file is about compliance. It's about identifying what's going on across the country in these different healthcare environments, what's being charged, what's being negotiated. It was never really intended to be customer facing, although part of the regulation is to make it customer facing. They were pretty clear. It was about research and analysis. Shoppable services, on the other hand, was that consumer facing piece where we'll go over what compliance looks like, but at least 300 items out there that people can go and shop and say, hey, I'm coming in for a CT of the head, and I want to know how much that's going to cost and what my insurance is going to pay for it, so that they could begin to shop hospital, healthcare system to healthcare system and make decisions. That actually is consumer facing and probably has the most benefit to the consumer, although we spend almost all of our time on the machine readable file. So with all of that in place in 2021, there were fines that were put in place. They said, hey, if this happens, you're going to get fined this much per day. It's going to go up or down depending on the size of the facility. Is it critical access? Is it PPS? Is it something huge like a Mayo Clinic or something? It's going to be proportional. And all of that was out there. And now, in theory, we're all worried about getting nasty grams from CMS and fines. Well, what actually happened? Um, you know, the Trump administration left office, Biden administration came in, and you could argue that nobody was paying attention over the last 4 years to compliance because we kept seeing CMS information come out as well as information from other organizations, whether it was AHA or HFMA, different places suggesting that 70 to 75% of hospitals were not compliant with the regulation. Well, we know there's all this fine process that's in there for compliance. So you would assume that the government's making a ton of money because people aren't compliant and they're paying fines for not being compliant. Well, at 70 to 75%, if I just round that and I say there's 5,000 hospitals in the country, then at least 3,500 of them aren't compliant. But then you look at the last 4 years, and there were only 28 hospitals that ever got fined. Um, so that's why I put compliance with a question mark, because I'm not real sure anybody was paying attention to compliance during that time. So that kind of brings us to 2025. And I think it looks different today and the horizon because we are dealing with Trump 2.0. So the Trump administration, the one who signed the executive order, who started price transparency and started this initiative, they left and now they're back. So the new sheriff is the old sheriff, and they're kind of re-looking at what they did. Has it been successful? Did it do what they intended? Did people do with it what they intended? How does it need to be changed? And so I think we have a far more aggressive look at the federal level at compliance, ensuring compliance, probably being very hard on compliance. And I think we saw that in the very first executive orders this year, back in February, because in essence, I will tell you, when those things came out, I was immediately inundated with emails and phone calls from clients going, okay, what does this mean? What do I got to do? How do we prepare? But in that moment, this is really the message that they were sending. We were serious about this. And it doesn't look like anybody else took it serious. So they sent out basically a warning shot and said, I want everybody to go figure out, how are we going to manage this? How are we going to ensure compliance? How are we going to change it so that we get the information we really want for ourselves and then to the consumers? And that was really what that was about. And it wasn't until we got to mid-year in June and July where we started to get information from the different agencies that said, okay, this is the plan, and this is what we're going to do, and this is what this means right now. So you saw a few things, right, where they're trying to define old rules while creating some new rules. So from an old rule perspective, this has always been in the regulation that you can't use a placeholder. You have to put real data in the machine readable file, but a lot of people were using like all nines as a placeholder for things like NDC numbers or for a negotiated rate or something like that, and it's not a real number. They could identify that, but they weren't really editing or auditing for compliance of that. They were really about format more than what was there, but they recognize it's there. So they have come out and said, hey, there's a regulation here and you can't use placeholders. This has to be real data. It's not useful if it's not. They also have probably, this is part of the major change that's this year as you prepare for 1/1/26, is that the previous standard for what we show is you show a charge, and then you show the most you get paid for it, the least you get paid for it, the cash price that you get paid for it if somebody comes in with no insurance, and then what does my insurance pay? What is the specific negotiated rate for each individual insurance? They changed that standard and tweaked it. And so now on 1/1/26, they basically added 3 columns to a machine readable file. And I'm not real sure how this is going to do what they expect it to do, but here we go. We're going to have the 90th percentile that we get paid, the 10th percentile, and the median, plus what this specific insurance pays, and then what the cash price is. I think the intent and the way they described it was 90-10, the 90-10 and the median, or the 50, if you want to look at it that way, is supposed to give better information on the volatility of negotiated rates and insurance payments by each charge. So, and that makes some sense, but I'm not real sure that most and least didn't do that as well. Because we all know that we all probably have an insurance, commercial insurance PPO that pays the highest. And then we have an MCO for Medicaid that pays the lowest. And so that hasn't changed. And so I'm not sure reporting it this way is going to make a big difference, but that's the intent. That's the law. And that's what's got to be in the machine readable and on your shoppables moving forward. The next thing that they kind of worked with was the attestation. So the attestation was introduced during that time period before this year. And we all know that each machine readable file has an attestation on it. It basically is what I call standard. Hey, to the best of our ability, we put this together with our current charge master, our current negotiated rates. We've included everything as best we can. And so you're attesting to the overall accuracy of the information that's in there. They have changed that a little bit in that it's still got to be there, but now there has to be a executive attached to that, an executive for the organization attached to that attestation. So a person who is attesting has to actually be identified. That was not true before. It was kind of just an organization wide. So that is also a difference that is there. The good news about that, just for me, in trying to make sure all my clients stay compliant, is that compliance for 1/1/26 looks way different than the effort that we put in 1/1/25. Because if you remember that nightmare, we were trying to get NDC information. We were trying to get drug units on there. We were trying to get the measurements on there. We were trying to get discrete data elements where most people didn't maintain it that way. There was a lot of effort in trying to get that done. Here, most of those changes, all of those changes are in format. And so formatting changes are far easier than substance changes, and that's what we see going on right now. So 1/1/26, if there's any good news, the changes are not as difficult. So now let's talk about what compliance looks like across 3 things. So the first thing I want to look at is the machine readable. So if we think about the specific formatting, there are regulations around the naming convention of the machine readable file. Remember what it's for. It's for research. It's to be able to pull it for compliance, to get information and analyze data. So they're looking for a consistent naming convention. The date that's on the file is important from a compliance perspective. It's important because you have to update once a year. So they're looking at the date in that file, that published file, and they're using that to identify if you've really done that in the last year. So you can't just put something out there and leave it. It does have to be updated once a year. Certain information has to be included, right? So that's the the columns. We'll talk a little bit more about that and the requirements on this particular screen. And then the file type. They gave us very specific file types that we could use. I will tell you that the majority of people are using CSV, kind of like it's what we use at SlicedHealth is a CSV file. And I think that when we chose that, and most people choose that, it's because it's one of the easiest file types to download and then integrate into whatever tool you're utilizing. But there are other file types like JSON that are also available to be used. But the use of the JSON kind of goes back and lets you know that, yeah, they always intended that to be research and analysis, not consumer facing. The attestation, I've already talked about this, and the difference is now having a named executive attached to the attestation. So it's not just the organization, but it's a human being inside the organization attesting. And then these requirements. I always want to go over these because some of these created a lot of confusion, and they do create confusion at times. Most of us are okay. We get revenue codes, CPT, HCPCS, NDC numbers, those kind of things. Having all the charges in the file, I think we're all good there. But then you get to this drug unit and drug type. This was such a big issue last year when this got added to the machine readable file, because everybody had it publicized in a machine readable file very quickly because it was included in their charge description. What they weren't prepared for is that it's not okay just to have a description that says, I'm going to give ibuprofen at 800 milligrams. It had to be broken out so that the unit 800 and the milligrams as a drug type, or a measurement would be also there, and they would be in discrete data elements. That was a horrible example because milligrams is not an acceptable unit type. So in that particular case, now you're trying to not only get those into discrete data elements, but now you're trying to figure out, is that one tablet? Is that one each? Is it one unit? And so you're having to do also that type of work to move from how you do it to how it's got to be reported, because there are only, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but 7 or 8 acceptable measurement types. So that was fraught with all kinds of issues. And so if you haven't done this step, be prepared, because it's not the easiest thing to do, because you've got to find a way to get that and pull that out of your formulary in discrete data elements. It can't be combined. Negotiated rates. This is one of those moments where I feel like the future is going to put a lot of pressure here. This was always intended to be, you signed a contract with Blue Cross. What did Blue Cross say they would pay you for that service? A lot of people have been utilizing a mechanism of saying, you know what, I had 100 people come in for this service, and on average, they paid me $150. So I'm putting that on there. Well, that's not a negotiated rate. That's an average of what you got paid, and it includes things like denials and where they specifically underpaid you for it, or where they didn't pay you for it. And so it's fraught with all kinds of issues. And I think you're going to see negotiated rate means negotiated rate, actual contract, actual fee schedule, actual calculation. Because the calculation has to be in the machine readable file. It's based on this fee schedule and 100% of that fee schedule, or it's based on 150% of this fee schedule. It's based on 98% of charge. Don't we wish? Whatever that calculation is, you've got to give that to how it gets to that negotiated rate. Modifier payment effect. right? So maybe one of the easiest ones is think about a 50 modifier that usually impacts um, a fee and how it gets paid at 150% of the normal fee schedule or some different rate. The issue here is that you got to think about is sometimes those modifiers are utilized differently by insurance companies. And so that payment effect does mean something, and they want that in the machine readable file. Um, Shoppable services. So this is the consumer side of this whole thing. Um, we all know, I'm going to put all this, we've got to have 300 items. That's the minimum, 300 shoppable services. The government said, hey, if you do any of these 70 services, these have to be included. So let's assume you do all 70. That means you get to choose what the other 230 are to get to that minimum. Um, if you only do 30 of the required items, well, now you've got to find 270 items to include. But they are looking for that minimum in the shoppable services. And then they are looking for this information, which we've already covered. The price, the cash price. So what is your cash discount if you come in with no insurance? What's the lowest? What's the highest? They've changed it now to the 90 median 10 percentile. What is your insurance's negotiated rate? When I think about shoppable services, I think about two things. I think about number one, this is the thing that can help your consumer. This is the thing that can actually create some goodwill or ill will with your patient base. And so I want to talk about that a little bit with just a couple of examples. So this first example that I'm going to use is what I define as compliance. So what have you got to show? You've got to show what is the procedure, what is the cost of that procedure, so what are you going to charge, what is the lowest negotiated rate that I have, what's the highest negotiated rate that I have, is it an inpatient or outpatient setting, and then what is the negotiated rate for my specific payer. Now, I used a horrible example, and I see it. You all see it. I've got a Medicaid on here, which gives me an opportunity to talk about what is also a part of compliance. Medicare, as administered by CMS, and state Medicaid, as administered by the state, is not required to be in the machine readable file. What is required is every Medicare Advantage plan, because that's Medicare based on a contract with a third party to administrate it, or an MCO for a Medicaid, because now Blue Cross is administering, or Ambetter is administering, or there's some other entity that's administering that product. Those have to be included. So just the way I have this on there, it looks like that's just straight state Medicaid, which wouldn't normally be included. The other element here is this cash price. And you can see here, we're saying it's 25% discount off of the charge. This gets you to compliance. With that in your shoppables, when somebody is looking for a specific item, that's compliance. Here's what I want to talk about. That is compliance around a specific charge in your charge master, giving them that information, how is this charge paid, and all that relative information. But notice that I've got something here called associated charges. Remember, this is a charge level, so it's not a claim level. And so now you have this decision to make. Do I hit compliance, or do I do one better and provide somebody with what that claim might look like? So let's assume this was a colonoscopy. Well, if all your charges are rolled up into that one CPT, and that's the way you charge, you're all good. But if you don't, and you charge separately for the propofol, for the supplies, um, for all these different elements, and these things may become a part of that bill, and let's just say they're 90% of the time they're all there. Do you want to include them here in your estimated cost and then in your payment? Um, I will tell you, if you do it that way, it's going to require some modeling of the contract to get to the actual negotiated rate. But it is an element, it's a step beyond compliance that you can put on your website. There's one other element. Maybe you want to take the extra step and now give somebody the opportunity to say, here's my copay, here's my remaining deductible, here's my coinsurance, and here's my remaining out of pocket, so that they can find out. In this case, I'm using a different example. It's not the exact same example as before, where Blue Cross is going to pay $336, so they're going to allow $336, but of that, the patient's going to owe $227 of it. You can make this a part of that shoppable. Well, now you're providing some goodwill, but you notice I said ill will, because if this isn't accurate, you're going to get a lot of conversation and a lot of phone calls potentially if people rely on this. So again, I go back to that scenario where I have a colonoscopy and I have CPT code and I charge a certain amount and I do all this work, but the actual claim has a bunch of other charges on it, things like that. Well, in that moment, you may have created ill will if you include this. So it's really a decision that has to be made at an executive level. How do I want this to work? Am I just trying to get to compliance? Do I want to do the extra work to pull some goodwill in for the consumer and give them the best information I possibly can versus all that's being required of me? Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So there's also compliance on a website. Sometimes this gets overlooked because we get so focused on that machine readable file. But this CMS hpt.txt file has to be in the root directory of your organization's website. And if it's there, what that means is I should be able to go to any hospital, go to their website, add the slash and the cms-hpt.txt, and immediately be presented with this information. If you go out to your website and you put this in, go from your home page and put the slash in the cms-hpt.txt and you get an error or you get nothing, that's a problem, because this is the way that CMS is pulling your machine readable file. They are not going to your website, opening up price transparency, hitting a download button. They are coming here, capturing this URL for the machine readable file and just copying it down. It's the way researchers are doing it. They write a script and they just go hit every hospital's website and pull it. Makes sense to me, right? Makes it easy, and it's quick. So that's why this particular text file is so important. The other things, you have to have a link to price transparency in your website footer. So this was done so that people could quickly just, if they wanted to check a website for compliance, they could look, go straight to the bottom of the page and see if there was a price transparency link. It also makes that consistent across all hospitals. So if you haven't done this, which is separate placement for the consumer to make it easy for them to get to price transparency. Everybody knows at least where to find it. This is a piece that in the beginning, I saw a lot of letters around this. Hey, your price transparency isn't obvious. How am I supposed to be able to find this? How would a consumer ever find this? A patient ever find this? You don't have a link to it that just says price transparency on your website. I think it's one of the reasons why they added this in the footer. But, and I haven't seen the nasty grams about this as much since that happened. But it is something to be aware of, because if you are taking the approach that, hey, I'm going to use this and make this available to my patients and make it easy for them to get to my shoppables and things like that, I would say separate placement for them that is obvious in your website, different than the one in the link in the footer, it would be necessary, because it shows that effort that you're actually trying to help them out. So what are the challenges? I would say there's no way I've got them all listed, but changes to the regulations, they're happening. They used to happen every 6 months. We've got away with a year where we have changes this year. I think that that's going to change, and I think it's going to speed up under this administration. State requirements. States decided, you know what, the federal government's required this, now we're going to get in the game. So now you're at risk of not only federal fines, but in some cases state fines. Those requirements usually don't change the requirement of price transparency. It's usually about reporting to the state those things, but that adds another element or level. Negotiated rates. I just talked about this. Is it a negotiated rate? Is it a swag? I almost got in trouble with Eden because I almost just said the acronym. But those things are going to become more and more important, I think, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's no way to get a negotiated rate without a contract and a fee schedule where it applies if it's not, based on charge. Just the sheer amount of information that's required in a file. I pulled a file, an MRF, to look at it, and I pulled what was an average client. And when I pulled the file and just started looking at it, I had almost 200,000 rows of information in that file. There are 26 data elements that are required across all insurances. The 5.1 million, those are the data points. There are that many data points in just an average file. And to maintain that is a challenge. And if you're doing that on your own, that is going to be overwhelming and can be overwhelming for that person who's given that, especially if it's a part of their job and not their job. So I think that's a real challenge. And it's one of the reasons why I tell people we're getting closer and closer to the moment where you may not be able to do this by yourself. You really do need someone who's staying on top of the regulation, making the changes to the form and the substance that needs to be included. Charge master maintenance. One of the biggest issues in the beginning was, look, you've got the whole point of the machine readable file is these are my charges and this is what I charge for service. Well, if you're not doing regular charge master maintenance, then you're always starting from behind when you're creating your machine readable file, because you'll have duplications of charge codes. You'll have charge codes that are no longer relevant in your charge master. You'll have charge codes with zero charge items in it. And all those things create problems inside a machine readable file. So this is a big challenge. including the formulary. That was huge when they did that, because just the amount of work to be able to get information out of a formulary, now tie it back to a charge in the charge code or charge master, and then be able to pull out discrete data elements that usually aren't kept discrete. It was fun times last year. And then markup formulas. I talk about this because there are a lot of us that have EMRs, and we had choices in how we set them up. And so a lot of charge masters will have supplies and pharmacy with 0 as the charge amount in the charge master, because what's happening to get the charge, in the case of a supply, I'm using LIFO, FIFO, last in, first in, first out, and I'm going to an invoice and I'm using a markup formula based on the invoice cost to get to the charge, and then the charge is put directly on the bill. It's never located in the charge master. Same thing happens with average wholesale price for the formulary. So these markup formulas, and knowing them and then being able to apply them to get the right price into the machine readable file becomes a challenge. And then the last thing is just discrete data elements. I've said it over and over. That drug unit measurement thing was a nightmare for so many people last year. Preparing. Here's what I would tell you. And I'm just going to go ahead and try to get all of these out here. Whoops. Yeah. Start early. If you start in December, you will not be prepared for January. I don't see it, depending on where the state that you're in. If you're just changing form, maybe, but if you've got some substance issues, I don't know how you get compliant on 1/1. Organizing contracts, negotiated rates. They require contracts and fee schedules. Gather those things up. Ensure the formulary information. Again, being able to pull the NDC and those discrete data elements out. Markup formulas. Make sure you have those and you're ready to perform those markup formulas, or give them to me if I'm doing it for you, or whoever is helping you. Plan for your shoppable services. How am I going to use that? And how am I going to select my 300 items? Am I going to do that based on usage? Am I going to do that based on department and different services? Just have a plan for how you're going to approach shoppable services. And then knowing your web maintenance structure. Ran across this a lot, where all of a sudden I told someone, hey, you got to put this cms-hpt.txt thing in your root directory, and people looked at me like I got 4 heads. And so knowing that maintenance structure is important. Knowing how to get the link to your price transparency, knowing how to get that file into your root directory, all those different things is going to be important. So just have a good understanding of who it is you got to go to, because sometimes it's not just IT. A lot of people have third parties that are managing these websites. So I want to close by talking about what's next. First thing, more changes more quickly. I think that what we saw early on while they were trying to figure out what it should look like and began changing data elements and stuff, and we saw things happen on an every 6-month basis. I think we're about to enter that phase again. And I think that we are, for lack of a better term, let off easy in January of 26. I would suspect that the changes that come will be a little more sweeping, a little more technical, a little more substance oriented, which will create far more anxiety. I would expect more anxiety like we saw around including the pharmacy information than just adding 3 columns and a name to an MRF file. I think that's one of the things that is definitely out there and going to happen. The second one we know, they are going to be far more intense about auditing for compliance. Meaning, in my head, and I think all of us, because I mean, we just see the personalities. Um, I can, when I say intense, I think about the most intense moments that I've seen President Trump when he's making some kind of point that he wants to make. I think they're serious about it. I think they will be intense about it. I think they are going to audit and they are going to, you're going to see a whole lot more activity around fines if you're non-compliant. I don't think it's no longer suggestion like it might have felt like over the last 4 years. I think now it's a definite requirement. And then the last thing, and for me, this is important, and this is what I think is a little bit scary. If I'm going to rely on the information that's in the machine readable file, then I've got to audit the substance of what's inside the file. And the attestation is a way of trying to get someone to say, hey, this is as good as I can do. I've done my best. And up until this point, all the compliance is around what does the machine readable file look like? Do you have the data elements being presented? It hasn't been about whether they're correct or not. And that at some point is going to shift. The way I describe it, my analogy would be at some point it's like your cost report or your tax return. Yeah, there are boxes. There's a certain way everything's got to be filled out, but at some point somebody's going to audit to make sure that the numbers are accurate. When that's coming, I'm not sure, but I see it in the tone and I see it in some of the guidance from early in February this year that there's going to be a direction towards substance over form like we haven't seen in the past. And in that moment, that's anxiety. Because if somebody were to ever point to a specific data element, let's say a negotiated rate in a machine readable and say, I need you to pull the contract. I need you to show me that on a fee schedule. I need you to show me the contract language that says this is the way this is calculated so that I can do this myself to prove that number. That moment is going to be scary for a lot of people, which is why I am happy that we do our price transparency around actual contract modeling and fee schedules, because it puts people ahead of that game when that starts to happen. It's just going to be a requirement. You're going to have contract modeling. I have talked a lot. And so I may have used up all the time, and I apologize, Eden. But I never know how long I'm going to go and what I'm going to say until it comes out. But hopefully that was helpful. It was a good overview and helps you know a little bit more about what's going on, the complexity, and kind of how to prepare.
Ken, that was wonderful. No apology necessary. You're right on time, and that was a fantastic presentation. While we've got one question in the chat that I'll get to in just a second, but I'll give, if anyone else has another question or anything that they'd like to ask while we're all together today, I'd be more than happy to. I'll stall a little bit so you have time to put that in the chat. But first off, Ken, a huge thank you to you. 1/1/26 is coming up quickly, and I think that you made a great point of if you start this too late, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to get on top of things and get ahead to a point where regulations and fees are not going to come back to bite folks. So I'm really grateful for your insight here. As we close up, we have one question in the chat asking, are Medicare Advantage plans and MCO reimbursements both required to be listed on price transparency?
They are. I noticed that when I did the shoppable that I had a state Medicaid showing up in my example, which was horrible of me. And I tried to answer that question then, but it is what I would call Medicare proper. It's being processed by CMS. You're sending it to CMS. They are paying, which of course they use intermediaries to get that done. What they're really after, and the same thing with the state Medicaid, you're sending it to the state. But they look at Medicare Advantage and MCO different because what they've done is they've taken a government program and now you are getting a third party agreement with somebody else that they didn't choose to run that program. And so there's all kinds of contract language and things that are different. And Lord knows I can talk for another hour about this because it creates chaos. Everybody, I think, without any exceptions, looks, if you're running a facility, they look at Medicare Advantage, and you do call it Medicare Disadvantage or Medicare Take Advantage because it's not helpful. But it's because the contract language is different. It's administered different than CMS. The same thing with the MCOs on Medicaid. That's why they require that in the machine-readable file.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate you going into some detail on that. I know you touched on the topic earlier, but I want to make sure we got a very clear answer for that here at the end. Folks, thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, we are always available and we'd love to answer them. If you'd like to talk with someone from our team about specifically what your needs are with price transparency and where you're at, again, we'd love to set up some time with you. You will receive an email from our team after this webinar, probably tomorrow morning, with the recording access and being able to go back through this. If you have any desire to talk with someone from our team or ask more specific questions, you can respond directly to that email, or you can reach out to our marketing team email address. It's marketingteam@slicedhealth.com. Very simple, very easy. Other than that, we will look forward to hopefully seeing you all on our next webinar. We are planning that for November 13th, so keep an eye out on our social media and your inboxes for an upcoming webinar as well. And Ken, finally, thank you again for your time. This was a fantastic presentation, and I so appreciate your hard work on this.
Yeah, I love doing it. Eden knows she just has to call. I will show up.
Well, I'm so glad that you all got to view this webinar today, and again, we'll send you that recording, but it will also be accessible on our website after this call. So thank you all, and enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you all.